The world was watching in silence. The world was waiting for a miracle, an answer, a moment that would change everything. And it came in the most unexpected of ways, from a man whose name was only whispered in certain corners of the globe, Ibrahim Traoré, the young and unyielding leader of Burkina Faso, stepped onto the stage in Moscow, side by side with Vladimir Putin, the figurehead of Russian power. It was a moment that defied expectations, one that would reverberate across continents, forever altering the course of history. The hook first 10 to 15 seconds in that instant, when the world was still reeling from global tension. One statement pierced through the noise like a dagger through the fog. We stand together, but not just as allies. We stand as guardians of the truth, Ibrahim Traoré declared, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. The room went silent, and every ear, every eye, was fixed on him, waiting for what would come next. Introduction and setup. Moscow, a city of towering spires and ancient history, felt like a place frozen in time. The chill of the Russian winter hung heavy in the air, and the streets were blanketed in a thick layer of snow, as if nature itself had chosen to pause and witness the unfolding of a moment that would be etched into the annals of history. Inside the grand hall, the air was thick with anticipation. Leaders from around the world had gathered for what was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting, a gathering of power and influence. But there was something different about this meeting, something that felt like the calm before the storm. Ibrahim Traoré, the man who had risen from the ashes of conflict in Burkina Faso, stood at the podium. At just 37 years old, he was already a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for those who had long been oppressed by foreign interests. His presence in Moscow was a statement, one that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. The Russian president, known for his cold, calculated demeanor, seemed almost human in comparison to the fire that burned in Ibrahim's eyes. The contrast between the two men was striking. One, a seasoned strategist, with decades of political maneuvering under his belt. The other, a young leader who had only just begun his journey, yet carried the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. Traoré's mind, however, was elsewhere. His thoughts wandered back to the day he first rose to power, the day his country was torn apart by forces beyond its control. He had seen the devastating effects of foreign manipulation, the devastation of his people, and the broken promises made by the world's so-called leaders. But now, as he stood on this grand stage, he knew that this was his moment. This was the moment to speak, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all those whose voices had been silenced by the tides of history. Conflict or challenge introduced as the applause began to die down, the tension in the room shifted. The leaders, the diplomats, and the journalists present all exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for the next words to fall from Traoré's lips. They had not expected this young African leader to be so bold. They had expected the usual flowery speeches of diplomacy, the usual promises of cooperation. But what they got was something else entirely. With a deep breath, Ibrahim Traoré looked out across the room, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces, each one marked by the weight of their own ambitions and the burden of their nations. Then, without hesitation, he spoke. "What is ours for far too long," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of oppression. "The world has been blind to the exploitation of Africa, or to the plundering of our resources, to the disregard for our sovereignty. Today that changes. We are not begging for your assistance. We are demanding the respect that is owed to us." The room fell silent again, the words hanging in the air like a weight too heavy to lift. The Russian president, normally unflappable, shifted ever so slightly in his seat. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the consequences of such a bold declaration. Midpoint revelation or twist, but what happened next took everyone by surprise. Putin, the mastermind of Russian power, stood up slowly, his face unreadable. He turned to Ibrahim Traoré and, with an almost imperceptible nod, spoke. "I have watched you, Ibrahim," he said, his voice low but powerful. "I have seen what you have done for your people. You have the heart of a lion, and you have the courage to do what many are too afraid to attempt. The world may think of us as opposites, but today we stand together." The room erupted into whispers, and the eyes of every leader in the hall were fixed on the two men, now bound by a shared sense of purpose. The twist had been revealed. What was once perceived as a mere diplomatic meeting had turned into something far greater. This was no longer just about Russia and Burkina Faso. This was about the awakening of a new order, one that would challenge the very foundations of global power. Climax emotional breakthrough, Ibrahim Traoré's heart raced. As he stood alongside Putin, but he felt no fear. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his country's history lift from his shoulders. He was no longer a young man struggling to hold together the shattered pieces of his nation. He was a leader, a symbol of defiance, a force that would not be ignored. "You are not broken," Putin said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "You are becoming. And today, we will show the world what true power looks like." Ibrahim nodded, and for a moment the two men stood in silence, the weight of their words and actions hanging heavy in the air. But the silence was not one of despair, it was one of hope. It was the silence of a world on the verge of change, of a new beginning. Resolution and quiet closure as the press conference ended and the leaders began to disperse. Ibrahim Traoré walked out of the room, his heart swelling with pride. He had done what many thought impossible. He had not just stood beside one of the most powerful men in the world. He had stood for something much greater. He had stood for the future of Africa, for the dignity of its people, and for the truth that had been buried for far too long. Outside the hall, the cold Moscow air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. In that moment, as he looked up at the snow falling gently from the sky, he knew that this was just the beginning. The world was changing, and he was a part of that change. And as he walked away, a quiet smile played across his lips. This was not just about power. This was about something much deeper, something that could not be measured by wealth or influence. This was about justice, about the righting of wrongs, and about the hope that tomorrow could be better than today. Call to action for YouTube. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing for more inspiring tales of hope, healing, and unexpected kindness. Hit the like button and share this with someone who needs it today.